Hey everybody, it's Courtney. I'm back here with another video for Trinity Stamps. Today I'm going to be creating a one-layer card using the Candy Jar stamp set, the Sweet Sentimini stamp set, and I'm showing you the Sweeter Than stamp set with all those little lollipops, but I didn't end up using that. So first I'm going to cut apart my stamp, which this is totally optional, but this stamp has 3 little candies inside this little candy jar, but I want to stamp mine separate. So I'm going to cut these apart and make these individual stamps. So I'm going to start with a craft knife, and I'm just kind of starting this, kind of creating a guide as to where I need to cut, but I'm not cutting all the way through at this point. For me, it's easiest to use my scissors. So once I have a little guide there and kind of know where I need to cut, I'll bring in my scissors and I'm just going to cut the inside of this little candy jar. Super easy. It does not ruin your stamps. And this way you have a little bit more flexibility as to how you're going to use this stamp. I'm also just going to cut a border, a small border around each one of these little candy stamps here to make these individual stamps too, and this will make it a little bit easier to stamp out when I am ready to use them. And then I'll just replace these in the packaging just as they were. They're just going to be separate stamps now. But again, this is totally optional. So next I'm going to go ahead and start stamping out all of my images. So I'm going to start off with my candy jar, and I'm using a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I'm bringing out my Misty here because this is a larger image. Going to go ahead and stamp this out with Memento Tuxedo black ink. And I did stamp this twice. This ink pad is super old. This is the first ink pad I ever bought. So you can see that I have a little bit of fuzzies that are coming from the ink pad because it's so old. It's not the stamp, it's the ink pad. But I'm in desperate need of some refills and I just haven't gotten them yet. I'm also going to stamp this image twice onto a piece of Simon Says Stamp masking paper. I'm going to be using 2 different masks. You can only stamp this once, but I wasn't sure if I was going to need both at the same time, so I did stamp this twice. So for the first mask, I should say, I'm going to use the outside. So I'm really only concerned about the inside of the jar itself where the candy is going to be. So you can see I'm cutting right along the black lines, and I'm not really worried about the top or the bottom of the jar because this part is not going to be used. And I'm going to use the outer pieces of the mask. I'm not going to use the actual mask of the candy jar itself. And I'm just going to place this on either side of my candy jar so that when I start stamping my candy inside, I make sure that I don't go beyond that black outline around the candy jar itself. This is optional if you feel like you can kind of control your stamping a little bit more than I can, then you don't necessarily need to do this part, but I don't really trust myself. So I'm going to be using a majority of the images in the stamp set for my little candies here, and I am going to also stamp these out onto another piece of the Simon Says Stamp masking paper that I'll have off to the side here and kind of mask as I go along because I want this jar to appear as if it's all full of candy. Some of them are going to overlap each other. So I'm going to start off with they're all pretty simple to cut out as far as the shapes go, but a lot of them are just round or oval, so they're really easy to cut. I'm going to stamp 2 of each of my images, go ahead and fussy cut my masks here, mask those out, and then move on to the next image. Now I was going to use this one little candy here, but I didn't want too much black in my card. So I decided to skip that one. That would be best for me with no line coloring, but obviously I didn't start the card out that way, so I'm not going to be able to finish it off that way. So you can see that I'm just stamping it twice on the card, stamp twice on the masking paper, fussy cutting that out, and then moving on to the next image. Now I am going to also create kind of like a table, I guess, where this candy jar is sitting. So I'm going to use some of these images for the little table as well to kind of scatter around my candy jar once all the masks are removed. So I'm just kind of continuing around. I'm not filling this up all the way, but I do want it to make it look as if it's pretty full towards the bottom of the jar. So I am overlapping, making sure that I do have candy behind other pieces of candy, if that makes sense. Then I'm going to go ahead and carefully remove the masks that I have made for the outer portion of the candy jar. I am going to go ahead and mask out that entire candy jar now, the traditional way. And then I'm going to take my T-square ruler and a pencil just to kind of roughly map out where my table will begin and end. And then I'm going to bring out some more of those little pieces of candy, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp those out onto the little table there, making sure that I kind of scatter those around. Some of them will be kind of behind the candy jar, but I'm not putting too many. I'm not overlapping them all that much, so I'm not really worried about masking them. I'm not going to do any ink blending on the table portion, so I don't have to mask. I'm only going to be doing ink blending behind the little candy jar, if that makes sense. So once all of my little candies are completely stamped out, I'm going to take a piece of Post-it note tape and I'm just going to mask out the bottom portion of my card panel where my little table will be. And I'm going to be doing some ink blending with Distress Oxide inks. I have Carved Pumpkin, Abandoned Coral, and Festive Berries here. Going to use a Trinity Stamps blending brush. Going to start off with the Carved Pumpkin towards the bottom, move on to the Abandoned Coral towards the middle area, and the Festive Berries will be on the top. Now you can see I'm not really worried about getting a perfect blend initially. I'm just kind of getting the color down, mapping out where I want each one of these colors to be, and then I'm going to work in reverse. So once I get to that Festive Berries on top, you'll see that I'm going to go back to that Abandoned Coral, make sure that these two colors blend well together, then move down to the Carved Pumpkin. And sometimes you got to work in both directions a couple of times in order to get a good blend. And I did have to do that with the Carved Pumpkin and the Abandoned Coral. I wasn't getting a perfect blend, but the more you go over it, the better blend you'll get. Keep in mind that the Distress Oxides kind of sit on top of the paper, so you don't necessarily need to add more ink each and every time. You just kind of need to work that area and work that ink around. So once my ink blending was done, I'm going to take some Shimmer Spray, and you want to make sure that you shake this up really good because all of the shimmery stuff kind of settles to the bottom. So I just kind of keep looking at the bottom, making sure that's all mixed up together. I'm going to remove the top portion and just use the nozzle to sprinkle on some of that in the background. Dab that up with a paper towel, and then I did let this sit for about 15 minutes or so, making sure that everything is completely dry before removing my masks. The masks that I use are very, very tacky, the Simon Says stamp masking paper. So you do want to make sure that everything is completely dry. Not only that shimmer spray, but also the ink. The ink stays wet for a very long time. So when you remove your masks, you just want to be super careful not to tear your paper as you're removing them. So I also removed all the little masks for my candy and my candy jar here. And then we are going to move on to the Copic Coloring. So I'm going to start off with the candy jar itself. I'm starting off with my lightest color, which is the BG10, and I'm basically just filling in the entire thing. I'm going directly over the little pieces of candy and everything because I'm not going to go around them, and it's such a light color that I can color directly over it once I get to the coloring of the candy itself. Going to move on to the BG15, and here's where I'm just going to be adding my shadows. So where this little lid or top of the jar is kind of hanging over the jar, that would create a shadow. Also, there's a lot of lines within the image that kind of show you where the reflection should be. And that's another mistake I made, but we'll get to that. But I'm going directly over that. My plan was to go over that area with a white gel pen to create those reflections, but you want a little bit of color underneath it to make it really stand out. I'm also adding some shading on either side of the candy jar, just leaving a little bit of a highlight on either side. So when I add that shading on either side, I'm leaving just a teeny tiny bit from that area to the edge of the image, if that makes sense. And this will give you a little bit of more of a highlight or a reflection as well. Going in with the BG11 and pretty much just going over those same areas, just thickening those areas up a little bit. And then finally, I will go back to that BG10 and kind of go over everything, make these colors blend a little bit more. I wanted this to be very light because I want it to be glass, but have just a little bit of color. Again, going directly over my images, not being too concerned about that. I'll just color directly over them. So next we're going to move on to the coloring of the little table, I guess you could call it here. It's not really a table. This is far from realistic looking, but I did want to add a little bit of shading to it. So I'm going to bring out some C markers. Going to start off with my C1 just to kind of get the paper saturated a little bit, and this will make my colors blend a little bit easier. Going to make the back portion of this little table the darkest, because the furthest something is away from you, if it's one object, the darker it will appear. Going in with the C5 and just adding a teeny tiny bit of that to the back portion of the table, blending that out a little bit with the C3, and then going back to that C1. Now you can see I'm leaving a whole lot of white space here because I do want this to appear white. I'm just adding my shadows. So I'm going to extend those areas out with the C1, and I don't have a darker C color. So in order to make this kind of fade to white, I'm going to go ahead and flick that color out, flick it out to the white area, and then I'm going to bring in my colorless blender, and I'm going to flick in the opposite direction. And this will get rid of those flick lines that you can see and kind of give you more of a seamless blend. Now, if you have a lighter C color, if you have a C0 or C00, you can certainly use that instead, but I don't, so I use what I have. So next we're going to move on to the coloring of the candy, and I am going to speed this up just a little bit in certain areas, but I just wanted to kind of make sure that I kept all the coloring in here so that you can see the color combinations that I used. I pretty much did my shading for all of the little candies, a majority of them the same way. So I'm starting off with this orange combination, which closely matches the background colors, and I'm just making a little C with my darkest color, blending that out a little bit further with the mid-tone, and then moving on to that lightest color. For the most part, I did use a 3-color blend on each one of the pieces of candy. I typically start with my lightest color first to get the paper saturated to make my colors blend a little bit easier. But because, especially in the candy jar, we've already gone over that area with the BG10, my paper's already saturated. So I'm able to get a really good blend without having to go in with my lightest color first. And even on the little table, most of those areas, we either went over it with the C1 or even the colorless blender. So I do have some saturation on the paper anyway, and I don't have to worry about starting off with that lightest color. For those little, I think they're called peppermint sticks maybe, I did add a little bit of shading with just the tip of my marker because there's not a whole lot of room to work with here, just on either side of it, because these would be more of a rounder object. I wanted to make sure that I kept a center highlight for those. For the little round and oval candies, there is a little curvy line in there that will kind of show you where the reflection should be. So I just used that to my advantage, and that is where I kept my shading, and later on we'll go in with a white gel pen to add that highlight back in. So for this little bear here, I used green combinations or yellow-green combinations, and once I got the coloring done, I realized that there was hardly any contrast at all. I didn't pick a dark enough color as that scary dark color that I refer to it as. So I didn't really get any contrast. So once the coloring was done, I am going to bring in a darker green and just go over those very darkest areas, and then very quickly with my lightest color kind of blend those into the rest. And I was able to get a little bit more contrast that way. So I was much happier with that. So just moving on to the next color combination here and finishing off the coloring of all of these little pieces of candy. Now these have little wrappers, so I am creating a shadow where the wrappers kind of on either side where they kind of twist it. That would also be a little bit darker there as well. Now I do have some, well, what should be white areas to some of these little pieces of candy, especially those little peppermint sticks that would be have those white stripes. And we already have some blue down because of the glass candy jar. And I'm fine with that because there would be a little bit of a blue tint to anything that is white in that candy jar. But I did add a little bit of shading with that C3 and the C1. So here's where I start screwing everything up. So I wanted to add, like I said before, those white highlights to the glass jar. So my initial thought was to go over those black lines that are already part of the image that kind of show you where the highlights should be. And it looked terrible. Had I used a darker color to color the glass candy jar, it probably would have looked a little bit better. But being I used such a light color, the white kind of just got lost. So I was very unhappy with that. But in order to fix that, I'm going to go ahead and just go over it with a pen. But you want to make sure that your white gel pen is completely dry before you do this, or else you're just going to smear it. So I also added some white gel pen details to a lot of the candies. Like I said before, I used the image itself and where the lines are within that image to kind of guide me as far as where to put those highlights. And then once that white gel pen was dry on the candy jar, I am going to bring out an EK Success journaling pen, which is also a Copic Safe pen. So I would recommend using a Copic Safe pen because even though we're not doing any coloring over it, we've done coloring under it. So this will kind of prevent it from kind of spreading out. So I'm using an EK Success journaling pen, and I'm going directly over where those black lines were that we covered up with the white gel pen to add those back in. I hated the white gel pen. So you can see that I'm kind of going off camera here, and that is because I am scribbling off on a scrap piece of paper. Because the white gel pen is kind of like raised up, I guess, from the paper, sometimes the tip of your pen can kind of, I don't know, scratch it, I guess, that white gel pen. So I'm just kind of scribbling off on a scrap piece of paper to get those little pieces of white gel pen that are stuck to the tip of my pen. But once I went over that area, I was much happier with the results. So next we're going to go ahead and move on to the sentiment, and I'm going to use the Sweet Sentiment stamp set. And here is another mistake. So as I was taking this out of the packaging, and I didn't, because my desk is so messy, you guys can't see how messy it is on camera, but it is messy. I still had my craft knife there. And as I put the sweet down, I kind of ran that across the blade. So at first I didn't really notice it. I didn't notice that there was going to be an issue, but there's always a way to fix this as well. So I lined this up directly over where I had terribly messed up with that white gel pen to kind of hide that. Going to stamp with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a black pigment ink. It gives you a super crisp impression, but it does take a couple of seconds to dry. And you can see there that I have a big line going directly through my word where it ran across my craft knife. So in order to fix this, I did let the ink dry for just a minute or so because it is a pigment ink. Then I took out my black Copic marker and I just filled in the areas that I didn't get a great impression or where I'm missing a big chunk of my stamp now. And you can't even tell the difference. So in order to finish off the card here, I am going to add a little bit of sparkle. No, I lie. I added a whole lot of sparkle to pretty much every single piece of candy. Well, I did. I think I added it to every single piece of candy. And then I'm going to take out some Nouveau glitter drops. And this is I think it's called White Blizzard. It's just clear with clear sparklies in it, and went over the gumdrops. This will appear as if it has little pieces of sugar on it like they traditionally do. And then I'm taking my glossy accents and going over all of the candy that is outside of the jar. And you can see I have my little pin there because mine kept clogging. So if your little nozzle clogs up, just take a pin, run that through the nozzle a couple of times, and you should be able to unclog that. So that is it. That is the card for today, guys. Thank you guys so much for stopping by. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Trinity Stamps channel. Have a great day. Bye.